Hello, everybody, and welcome to Legacy Impact, a summer women's Bible study. This is session 5, the pouring. We have been going on for, 5 weeks this week, and we have just been diving into the idea of intergenerational ministry or ministry between the generations of women in the church. We've had some awesome discussions, and now today is the day we get super practical. We have talked about the theology of discipling one another. We've talked kind of about how to make sure we are ready to be a discipler, and now it is time to talk about the pouring out into another young lady or older lady. Whatever lady you decide to be your disciple, now we're going to talk about the pouring out process. This session is going to have a lot of stories and a lot of tips that you can do to disciple your disciple. I'm super excited to get into it, so let's just dive right in. Okay, so I'm a discipler. Now what? I officially am going to be somebody who pours into another person. I even might have my disciple figured out. Like, I know I've seen her, and now I have to get her to meet with me. How do I do that? So this was my first disciple. This was Elena. She is my cousin. I introduced you guys to her probably in the first session. And now we're going to talk about how do you even get started with this? I know that I want to pour into Elena. God is calling me to that, but I don't know how to sit down and just talk with her. Like, maybe you've seen your Elena or your disciple at church, and you kind of like chit chat about the weather at the cafe right before Sunday school. But now I got to sit down with her. How do I do that? First things first, you got to do your first meeting. So let's take a look at what our most famous discipler and how he handled meeting his disciples. So Matthew 4:18 through 20, the greatest discipler in the world, Jesus Christ, was walking by the Sea of Galilee, and he saw two brothers. This was Andrew and Peter, by the way, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed them. I really wish that it was that easy for us. But listen, we're not Jesus. We can't just do the Jesus stare and acquire the disciples. Now this is what always gets me, is in every movie about Jesus, every actor portraying him has a different version of the Jesus stare. It's usually in the big silent part of the film, they stare into somebody's soul, and the music swells and everyone's like, whoa, he's so cool. And then they just drop their nets and just immediately follow. But here's the thing. We can't just do the Jesus stare and people are going to think that that's a normal thing and that we're cool enough to hang out with. We got to be a little bit more creative. So how do we get the first meeting with somebody? This is something that I've heard a lot of people who are just starting to disciple others have a hard time with. They're like, isn't it weird to invite somebody to talk with you? Somehow that initial asking to hang out is really difficult for people. So maybe let's not do the Jesus stare to invite them to talk with us. Maybe we should look at some other things that Jesus has done to encourage people to talk. So let's actually look at Matthew 9:10 through 13. And Jesus reclined at the table in the house. He is at I think he's at Levi's house right now, or Matthew's house, the tax collector. So he's at the tax collector's house, and he's at the table reclining. And behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners?" So there's just a good image of how Jesus did discipleship in action. He ate with people. He ate with people. He reclined, or back then in Middle Eastern cultures, in past times, they didn't really have chairs. They reclined at a table that was kind of lower to the floor. So he just hung out around a table, and that is something that Americans can absolutely get behind: food. So I'm going to teach you 3 words. They're like the most used words in my ministry probably ever. Let's get coffee. So easy. Such an easy thing to say, and it's so like not weird to ask. It's so common for Americans to get together and sit at a table and have coffee. In fact, actually, one of our students taught me a 6th love language. You know how they always say that there's 5 love languages? Well, apparently there are 6, and the 6th love language is food. Now, if you guys don't like coffee or your person doesn't like coffee, like I take youths out all the time, and some of the younger ones don't like coffee, so I take them out for ice cream. And if they don't like ice cream, I'll go to cheesecake. I'll take them to Mexican food. I don't care what the food is. I'm just going to take them because there's something about sitting face to face at a table. Jesus clearly understood this himself. He's leaning back and reclining at a table, and there's something very disarming about it and like unofficial. We've been talking on and on about how we want our mentorship, our discipleship to feel very organic. We don't want it to feel stiff, like, oh gosh, I gotta be really good at this, and my disciple needs to listen to what I say. We want to be organic and natural. And what's more natural than just sitting and eating with somebody? You're naturally going to be talking to them because you're face to face with them. But some people, like my husband, is not much of a like sit across from somebody and eat. So there's like a million things that you can do that's not necessarily eating, but just do something that the other person naturally enjoys. So, for example, Jordan takes people disc golfing like all the time. If they don't like disc golfing, you can go for a walk. Sinisippi is like mostly shaded and has awesome walking paths. I love going to Sinisippi and walking with people. You could take them bowling. You could play board games with them. Becky mentioned that she talks to the people who are babysitting her kids like before and after they have left. So before they leave and leave the babysitter with the kids, Becky will make sure to talk with them, or whenever they're just getting back, they'll talk with the babysitter before the babysitter leaves for the night. But if you've got like a backyard, cookouts and bonfires are an amazing way to just hang out, food's involved, sit around the fire. There's great fellowship you can do. Anyway, there's no limit to the things you could do with your disciple for that like first meeting where you're just kind of shooting the breeze, seeing if y'all meld well together. But just do something that's natural, not just like, we're going to sit at a table and read a Bible. The first meeting is something very natural, something that's not going to be stiff, I suppose. Another thing to pay attention to is discipleship can often start by fulfilling physical needs. I have noticed this more and more as I walk around and listen to y'all's table talks in the last couple sessions. A lot of people have been describing their discipleship process, and it's always starting around like, I was cleaning this young lady's house who was going through something, or I delivered groceries to this person, or the big thing that I've been hearing is like, this person needs a ride from place to place. So as I ride with them, we've been discipling. So that's been really cool to see. Y'all are starting the discipleship process, and y'all are doing it by fulfilling physical needs first. So be aware that like if you're fulfilling a physical need for somebody, that might turn into discipleship. So as you are thinking about this, we're going to do our first table talk. So for you guys online, just pause the video and maybe journal about it, or if you watch it with somebody else, talk with them about who will you reach out to? Who is the person that you're going to ask out to coffee? Or how can you gather with them? If it's not coffee, what else could you do with them? Okay, so you have officially done your first meeting with your disciple. Awesome job. Y'all got through it. You had your coffee. It was great. Now let's meet again. Hey, I'm thinking about discipling you, or I'm thinking about, let's talk about God a couple times, or let's talk about God regularly. I'd love to meet with you again. And they're like, yeah, cool. All right. So you officially have a disciple. Now it's time to get deeper. So we need to follow Titus 2's example. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good. And I look at that verse and I'm like, great, but what's good to teach? Like, great, there's so many biblical things that I could be teaching, but what's the best? What's the thing that we're called to teach? What do we need to prioritize? And to be honest, we don't need a Rolodex of Bible verses because most people can read the Bible. And if they can't read the Bible, there's Audible or podcasts that read the Bible to them. You can watch famous pastors or famous Christian theologians on YouTube. They often have YouTube channels. You can watch sermon series online. You could listen to podcasts. There's a million ways you can get biblical teaching. So a disciple might not necessarily be asking for your expertise on reading the Bible. So that's good news for us. We don't have to be Bible scholars to be a disciple. Because oftentimes they're not looking for education. They are looking to see how applying the Bible is done to your daily life. They need to see what a godly woman looks like. They don't need to read the Bible verse of women should be blah, 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 and that's a godly woman. No, they need to actually see what that looks like in 2024. So most of the time, you are going to be showing them what a godly woman looks like, not necessarily telling them how to act. In fact, as I was preparing for this series, I started asking my disciples, what did you guys even see in hanging out with me? What did I say or do? What have I done that has been the most influential for you? And they never cited anything I said. Not a single one of them was like, Raegan, when you said this, it changed my life. It is actually what I do that has made the most impact in their life. They are paying attention to things that I'm not even aware that they have been paying attention to. The kind of music that is in the car whenever I pick them up. They pay attention to how I respond to stressful situations. A lot of them are in the tech room and they see me when the tech starts catching on fire. Okay, nothing's actually caught on fire, but you get the idea. Something bad happened in the tech room and they're watching how I react to it. They pay very special attention to how I talk to my husband. That has been very interesting. In fact, Jordan and I have talked about it, and he makes a point to appear before me and my disciples. He doesn't just shove himself off in another room. Now, granted, I do have private conversations with my disciples that he goes into a different room for, but if there's food on the table, he's sitting there with us because it's been really important for the disciples to see how a husband and wife talk to each other. That's been really interesting that I just didn't realize they would be paying attention to. And when Jordan's hanging out with guys, they'll often eat pizza and talk, but then I'll come out maybe an hour later and we'll play board games. And then the wife is there. So they get to see how a Christian wife should be treated. They also pay attention to how I manage my mental health. They pay attention to how I pray. They pay attention to the things I get angry about. And notice how some of these things are touchy subjects. Some of the things that they've mentioned that they've noticed about me, I'm like, ooh, could you not notice whenever I'm having an anxiety attack? Or could you not notice whenever I get angry about something? I don't want people to pay attention to that. But that's the point. The point is we're not supposed to be perfect, and our disciples aren't perfect. And so they probably feel like God can't talk to them in their worst moments, or that they need to know. They need to know that nobody is perfect. One of the hardest lessons that I have learned is even in my dark moments where I feel particularly fleshy, it's still somehow speaking to my disciples about a godly character. And it's so bizarre to think about that. But I remember specifically, I had a disciple come in, and she was talking about a fight that she had with her boyfriend. And her boyfriend called her a very bad name, not appropriate at all. And she kept making excuses for him. She was like, oh, he had too much to drink, and so he wasn't in his right state of mind. If he was sober, he would have never said that. And this was a part, I had to pray as she was telling me this. I'm like, I feel like I need to address this. And I was like, do I really want to get into like this conversation? And God was like, yes. He pushed, and he was like, yes, you need to open up about your fights with your husband and how he treats you. So I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to get into this. But I did. I got into it, and I said, listen, like, my husband gets angry because spouses get angry at each other. And sometimes you get so angry that you're just almost out of your mind. You're just furious. And so I was like, my husband gets angry at me sometimes. Like, we get in fights, and he gets angry. And sometimes he gets out of his mind angry, but never once has he ever called me a name, let alone a name like that. And so I kind of like showed her some examples of like what we fight about and how we talk to each other in the middle of that fight. And I could tell she was just like soaking this all in. She had no idea that even in our fleshy moments of arguing with each other, we still can have a godly character, and we're still setting an example for how Christians who sin should be fighting. And I've had some disciples who have broken up with their boyfriends specifically because they are watching my marriage and they see that things could be better for them. And so they have broken up with their boyfriends and have gotten better boyfriends just by the example that we have set, even when we are normal Christian couples who fight sometimes. So it can be weird. It can be almost icky feeling to show a godly character and to open up your life, your whole life, to a disciple. But that is what God is calling us to. We don't need to make an appearance that everything is lovey-dovey or everything is happy-clappy. We have to show who we really are, because that is where they are going to learn what a godly character looks like in the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of life. So we just talked about how to show, not tell. But on some level, you are talking with your disciple, and you might be talking with them for like, I do about 2 hours every other week. And you got to say something. You can't just be in silence. So what the heck do you actually say to them? And again, you don't need a Rolodex of Bible verses. You don't need to plan a whole sermon. I found this verse again. I pulled it out of our session 1, and I found it again because it's just so good, and we're kind of coming full circle from our first session. Paul was talking to the Corinthians, and he said, I did not come to you proclaiming the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. He's not writing sermons that are like way philosophical and stuff. He decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. There is nothing more powerful to your disciple than your testimony. Just like Paul, we don't need anything complex. Start simple. Start with your story. Who is Jesus to you? What has Jesus done for you? Especially when you're first meeting with your disciple, they're going to probably be on the quieter side, because whenever you say like, I'm going to disciple you, automatically like some defense walls come up, and they're like, I don't know if I want to share my life with you. Like, what if you judge me? So it's important for us to kind of bare our souls first and show that vulnerability. So I often start by filling the silence of our first couple sessions with random stories about how God has moved in my life, or how I have messed up and God has saved me. Because how do they know God will save them if they haven't heard that God saved you? You might have a lot of storytelling to say the first couple times because they might not talk. And that's okay. That's very normal. So this is kind of what you're teaching. You're teaching how you live your life. And that can be nerve-wracking. So let's talk about it on our table talk. Are you nervous to share your life with others? Yes. But just talk through that a little bit. Maybe there are some other people at your table who can encourage you to kind of push past that nervousness. It's okay to share your life with a disciple. All right, we're going to keep on trucking here. We're going to talk about perfectionism. Perfect is not the point. We just kind of talked about that previously. We talked about how we don't necessarily need to be perfect, but now we need to kind of put the shoe on the other foot. Perfect is not the point for your disciple either. And what I really love is that God has already established accountability. So we don't necessarily have to be perfect. And that's why we need to be poured into as we are pouring into other people. So this was from session 3. We talked about the chain of discipleship, how Jesus was holding Paul accountable, who held Timothy accountable, who held Timothy's church accountable. So Timothy is pouring out everything to his church, and Timothy isn't a perfect guy. And that's why he had Paul pouring into him. It's just like us. We don't have to be perfect, but we do need to have accountability. So anyway, just throwing that out there. If you have more questions about that, go to session 3. We talked more about it in detail. Don't be afraid to show your struggles. It's freeing to both of you. But also at the same time, be aware your disciple will in turn show their struggles. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how do we deal with sin issues in our disciples, because it's messy. We're messy people, and our disciples are going to be messy people. So we're going to go back to Matthew 9 with the Pharisees. I think this is so timely because Aaron literally just had a sermon about Phariseeism, or the ideology of the Pharisees and hypocrisy and stuff. So it was just so funny that he was talking about that, and now here we are talking about it again. When the Pharisees saw this, just backtracking, Jesus is reclining with the tax collectors and sinners. He's eating with them at Levi's house. So when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners?" But when he, meaning Jesus, so when Jesus heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." So you can't forget, Jesus came to us because we are sick. We are not well. We need a physician. We are sick. So whenever you're dealing with a disciple and perhaps they are sharing some of their ick, it's so important to remember that you are also sick, and that sanctification is a process. That is so, so important. So like, I've been a Christian for 20 years or whatever, and my disciple might have been a Christian for like 6 months. So I have like the list of godly attributes that I follow, and then the list of things that I still need to work on. Their list might look completely different. So we have to remember that the standards that your disciple is following is not necessarily the standards of you. You might be chewing on spiritual meat, and they might be chewing on spiritual milk. I guess they're not chewing if it's spiritual milk. But just remember that sanctification is a process that we are all on. And so we can't necessarily hold our disciple to the same standards that we have. They might not be there yet. And so it is really difficult as mentors to figure out, when do you talk about a sin issue and when do you not? It's so hard. But just remember that we are all sick, and that sanctification is a process. They might not be in the same spiritual place as you, and so inflicting your spiritual burdens on them might be too much for them to handle. But let's just talk about sin issues. There is a clear sin issue in their life. Okay, how are we going to handle this? And I love what Paul writes in Galatians 6, 1 through 2. "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Now, because of time, I didn't really get to talk about that last chunk, but maybe just be aware, like, as you deal with other people's ick, it can, like, turn into your ick too. So be watchful of that. Some of my disciples struggle with the same sin issues I do. I have TV shows that I can watch. I have TV shows that I definitely shouldn't be watching. Same way with my disciple. There's TV shows that they should be watching. There's TV shows that, given their sin issue, they probably shouldn't be watching. And because certain disciples are like me, we have the same TV shows we shouldn't be watching, but goodness, is it a guilty pleasure to watch it. So it's really easy, like, to hear my disciple talking about a TV show that they just watched. And like I said, they're not in the same stage of sanctification that I am. So they might not be convicted by watching it, but I am. And they'll talk about how great the latest episode was. And I'm like, man, I would love to just nerd out with them and talk about the TV show that I really want to talk about. So keep watch of yourself. You might also be tempted, because we're talking about sin issues here, and sin is just tempting. But what we're going to focus on today, that was just kind of an aside. What we're going to focus on is restoring in a spirit of gentleness. And that, again, I can't give you like, this is what gentle is, this is what gentle isn't, because it changes depending on who you are. It changes depending on who the disciple is. Elena has always been, because she's my cousin and I've known her all my life, and we have had such experiences together because I've been discipling her for so long. I don't have to be too gentle with her. I can just be like, girl, you need to stay away from that. But that's gentle to her because we're family. I can talk to her kind of like a big sister. But there are some disciples where if I even remotely mention something that I think they should be doing differently, they could just melt. And so I have to choose my words very carefully, depending on my disciple. So I can't necessarily tell you what is gentle and what isn't gentle. You have to judge that for your disciple. But in regards to sanctification being a process and in regards to gentleness, I have a rule of thumb. Brokenness is like a pile of pickup sticks. Because sins often, they like feed into each other. And sometimes there's like the sin that branches off into this sin, that branches off into this sin. And it's so hard to figure out which sin to address first. Which stick is going to pull out the fastest and the easiest. This was actually an analogy that a pastor told me once, and it was about spiritual healing. For example, somebody who is dealing with, like, let's just say an addiction to alcohol. They have a woman who's dealing with alcoholism. That's the stick on top. But under that stick, she's dating bad guys who also drink. So there's another stick that we got to deal with. But maybe they're dating bad guys because she has low self-worth, which is another stick that we got to pull out. And maybe she has low self-worth because she doesn't believe that God loves her. Now that's a big stick that we got to get out of there. And maybe she has gotten that belief that God doesn't love her because she has had like an abusive man tell her that God doesn't love her, or like a spiritual trauma, a religious trauma. And oftentimes our disciple just gives us the whole pile. Well, I do this because of this, and then you got the whole pile. And it's like, which stick do I pull out first? And I always just say, pick the most damaging one first. I really love this verse in Matthew. I feel like it really shows the pile of pickup sticks and how sometimes you try to like take one off, but you don't touch the other ones, and the person just gets right back into the sin issue. You pull them out just in time for them to fall off the bandwagon again. Now, this verse in Matthew is talking about literal demon possession. I'm not necessarily talking about this in a literal sense, but everybody's got inner demons. Everybody's got sin issues, and I feel like they work in much the same way. So Matthew 12 says, When an unclean spirit has gone out of a person, so you've taken that stick off the pile, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but it finds none. So it says, I'll return to my house from which I came. And then it comes. It finds the house empty and swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and dwell there, and the last state of that person is worse than the first. This happens all the time, especially when you're dealing with like somebody who's in addiction. If you address the drugs, but you don't address the low self-worth, the friends they hang out with, the belief that God doesn't love them, if you don't deal with those underlying issues, the addiction is just going to come back. And that's so hard to figure out. And I always say, choose the most damaging stick first. Oftentimes it is the heart. Correct the heart first, and the behavior will follow. So with that stick of like addiction, bad boyfriend, low self-worth, God doesn't love her, religious trauma, the first thing you want to do is just like take off the addiction. But honestly, the first thing you got to do is that heart work, that correcting the heart, helping them understand that God does love them. And then when they believe that God loves them, their self-worth grows. And when their self-worth grows, they see how bad the men in their life treat them, and they get rid of the man. And then the addiction gets addressed. We have to remember that God is in the middle of this process too. God is there to convict them one step at a time. So this is all like a huge caveat. Just because of my past and like my hometown situation whenever I was younger, I dealt with a lot of people who handled addiction or like were in abusive relationships. So your disciple might not be getting into this kind of like heaviness. But I think it's important to just understand that if you feel overwhelmed by a sin issue, start looking for that pile of pickup sticks and start looking at which one is the best one to pull out, because you can't just yank the whole pile. That's going to overwhelm them. That's going to just create a bad situation. And you also have to remember that God's love is steadfast throughout all of this. He's not surprised by the pile of pickup sticks. He knows exactly what they need, when they need it, and we're trying to look like Jesus to these people. So it is He who remembered us in our lowest state, for His steadfast love endures forever. And He rescued us from our foes, for His steadfast love endures forever. We have to remember that God's love is going to endure for them forever. And so sometimes you get disappointed by the sin issues in your disciple's life, and you just have to be like, God's enduring. God's love is enduring. I have to endure it too. I still love them. What do I got to do to show how steadfast we are in the midst of the pile of pickup stick chaos? Sometimes it is 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. Yep. Sometimes it's like that. They take a bunch of steps and they're seeing breakthrough, and then they mess up. And then they take 3 more steps forward, and then they mess up. You have to look at the overall progress on those days where they're taking steps back. You have to remember that this is human nature. We mess up, we get back on the horse, and we try again. So keep your love steadfast in the midst of all of it. Just hold on. God's in the middle. God's working with them. It's going to be okay. But let's talk about this. This is probably the hardest part about disciple making, is when do I know when to address these issues and how should I address these issues? Let's talk about it in our table talk. Hard conversations, it's a part of discipleship. You're discipling someone, you're going to have hard conversations. How would you pray and how would you prepare for a conversation? Talk about that in your table talk. Okay, so we're getting ready to close this all up. And some of y'all might be wondering, like, this is not what I thought discipleship would look like, or this is not how I disciple. Maybe you disciple and it looks nothing like mine. That's okay. My discipleship, I've noticed, looks different than everybody else's, just because God has tailored me for a specific type of discipleship. Discipleship looks very different depending on who it is. So my sit-down conversations with ladies are often, I'm sitting there and they're talking about what they're going through, and I give godly advice, or I tell them a story about whenever I struggled. But some people do videos, some people do books. I know Becky specifically meets with girls regularly, and she'll walk through a book with them, and she'll kind of like vet the book beforehand and figure out like which one's going to be good for them to talk about. I wanted to leave you guys with some resources and not just like throw you out into the deep end like, all right, talk about all the sin issues. So let me give you guys some resources on how to mentor others. One of the big ones that really inspired Becky and I to start this Bible study was Kate McGill's book, Silver Threads. And it's all about intergenerational ministry. Kate McGill talks about how she specifically discipled young moms. And so like while the baby was taking a nap, Kate McGill would come over and like wash the mom's dishes while the mom took a bath. Or Kate McGill would talk with the mom during playtime with the kids and tell them how to, talk to the kids about God and stuff. And so that's another person whose discipleship looks way different than mine. She's more into like go into the home of the person you're discipling and serve, basically. Really good stuff in here. I can't recommend this book enough. It's super great. It's on Amazon. The QR code is right there if you want to look into it. The other one that I really kind of pulled from in regards to this series was Bill Allison's book, The Disciple Making Genius of Jesus. We have disciple makers conferences. We've been having them like once every 6 months, but Bill Allison comes fairly regularly. He is great. I love going to his conferences all the time. It's all about mentorship. If you have not seen Bill Allison, I strongly recommend going to those conferences. The conferences are totally free. This book was also super good. It goes into what he talks about in the conferences just in a little bit more detail. QR code's right there. That'll take you to Amazon where you can purchase it. The third book that we read, that Becky and I read, was Organic Mentoring. This one was probably a little bit of more of a heavier read, whereas the other two were pretty light reads. So this one is a little bit more ministry leadership focused, but also a super good read if you're looking for something to chew on. Absolutely recommend this. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was Right Now Media. Right Now Media is something that you might have heard about at our church. It is basically Netflix for Christian Bible studies. There's so many different Bible studies that you can choose from on here, and they're all video Bible studies. We use this for our life groups. So like the life group leaders can pick a Bible study and play the video, and then you just kind of like ask questions about the video. And that's how a lot of our Sunday morning life groups go. But this is a free resource for anybody at church. So if you're looking to disciple somebody and you're not quite sure what to teach with them, I do this sometimes with my younger disciples because I'm more into like the high school discipling. So like middle school can be a little bit difficult for me to kind of just organically pull stuff out. So I've been doing Right Now Media with some of the middle schoolers, and it's really, really nice. And like I said, it's totally free. Our church pays a subscription so that our church members can have this. So if you want more on Right Now Media, email Becky and I, and we can get you the account. So if you're looking for more on how to practically be a disciple maker or be a mentor, those are great resources. As we kind of talked about what discipleship looks like and how it's different for everybody, the last table talk I'm leaving y'all with is, what does discipleship look like to you? It might not look like mine. It might not look like Becky's. It might not look like anything we have shown you. But what does it look like to you? Try to visualize what discipleship looks like for you.